this is one of my favorite times of year, maybe my favorite time of year. I love the Christmas season. And it's amazing to me just how awesome Christmas is, because you think that, even in our secularized society, even in our postmodern society, our post-Christian society, Christmas still has this thing about it, right? Even non-Christians recognize that. They talk about the magic of Christmas, or the spirit of Christmas. But something you and I know as believers is we know that the magic of Christmas and all that it's not the toys, it's not the gifts, it's not the great baked goods, it's not all the lights, it's not the festivities, it's not the family traditions, it's not the cold on the outside. Well, that's kind of weird when it's 70 degrees today, or the warmth on the inside. It's the fact that God came down. That it's not that we celebrate the birth of a major religious leader. It's that God became one of us and took on human flesh, as Lee was saying before. That's the incredible part of Christmas that we celebrate. In 1865, William Chatterdam, he wrote the hymn, or the Christmas carol, "What Child Is This?" to the tune of Greensleeves. And we know the start of it. It goes, "What child is this who laid to rest on Mary's lap is sleeping?" And I don't know about you, when I was a child, I heard those words and I'm like, what do you mean, what child is this? You're grown-ups and you're singing, "What child is this?" I'm a kid, and I know this child is Jesus. What they're talking about, who they're singing about is Jesus. But what we know, and what I know now, is there's different types of questions, aren't there? There are informative questions, wanting information. And those are like, what time is it? How old are you? What's the weather? Those are questions looking for information. But there are also questions that are making a point. And we call those questions rhetorical questions. When Romeo asked Juliet, "What's in a name?" he wasn't looking for an actual answer, right? And you think about how many songs to have rhetorical questions. When you talk about ones like, "Why do birds suddenly appear every time you are near?" It's saying, man, you are beautiful. That's the point it was making. Or "Who let the dogs?" No, I don't think that was one of them. But you also, you think about when we make the point of course, we say, is the sky blue? Is water wet? Is the Pope Catholic? We say things like that. But if somebody ever asks you, how could I be so stupid? Don't answer that question. It's a rhetorical question, okay? But there's also other questions where it's a statement of awe and wonder, right? And an example of this would be in Mark chapter 4, when Jesus calmed a raging storm with 3 words. He said, "Peace, be still." And the disciples are blown away when this happens, and they're thinking, who could this guy be that he can tell a storm to shut up and it shuts up? And they said this, they said, "Who is this man that he can speak to the wind and the waves and they obey him?" Right? And so that's the thing too, is I really believe that William Chatterdam was making the last 2 statements, that he was making a statement and he was in awe and wonder of who is this child. And that's one thing that we're going to do for the next few weeks during Christmas. We're going to be answering that question. I thought to myself, I thought it out, and I thought, I've probably preached 150 to 160 different Christmas messages. But something that's neat is I think God really gave me something this year that's really different from just about anything I've ever heard. And I love that. And I think it's going to be really cool, because we're going to take a look at what child is this? Who is this guy? Who is this child? What does it mean for our life that God was born? What does it mean for our life? And let's start with Matthew chapter 1. And here it is. "She," talking obviously about Mary, "will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Now, usually in our society, not always, but usually in our society, we pick names for our kids because we like the name, or we like the sound of the name, or it reminds us of somebody, or it's a member of the family, or it rolls off the tongue easily when combined with our last name. That's usually why people pick the names. But that meant nothing to the people in biblical days. They picked the names for their children because of the meaning of the name. And it was, they were making a revelation about the child, or something about God, or something about life, something about the world around. They were making basically a statement. Now, when Mary and Joseph, when they were given the name for the child, both separately by angels, one we know was Gabriel, the other is not mentioned the name of that angel that gave it. Both of them, the angel said, "You're going to name this child Jesus." Now, Jesus was the New Testament name for the Old Testament name Joshua, and probably in those days you would pronounce it Yeshua. And what the name means is Jehovah is salvation, or it's a statement, God save. And so when we ask the question, who is this child? One of the answers is this child came to save us. Came to be the Savior of the world. In fact, we read that when he said that named him Jesus because for this reason, he will save his people from their sin. What child is this? He's the Savior, came to earth. All this took place, going on with verse 22, to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, Matthew is quoting from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, when Isaiah says that that this child is going to be born of a virgin. Now remember, he's saying this 700 years before Jesus was born, and he's making that statement. Now, we're going to do something. We're going to have a little fun and kind of take a detour here and talk about messianic prophecies, because that's what that is. Messianic prophecies is times when you see in the Old Testament where God gives these signs and says, and he's basically saying, when somebody fulfills all these signs in all these books, then you're going to know that that person is the Messiah, the Christ, God in human flesh. That's what you can know. And there's hundreds of them talking about Jesus. And you think about it, it's one thing to make a prediction or a prophecy, right? It's another for that thing to actually be fulfilled. Let me give you an illustration. I would, if somebody asked you where the president 50 years from now, whoever's president there, where they would be born, you could take a guess, but the chances are you'd be wrong there. But Micah, 700 years before Jesus was born, said the Messiah was going to be born in a little town called Bethlehem. If you asked, how would the president die 50 years from now, especially if he died in a strange way or she died in a strange way, what would you say? David was able to say that. David was able to say 1,000 years before Jesus was born and said, this is how he's going to die. His hands and feet are going to be pierced. And he went on to say other things, like he was going to be mocked. In fact, he used the exact words of how he was going to be mocked when they mocked him when he was on the cross. And he even went into details about how that in Psalm 22, all of this was just in even one psalm, talked about that the people would divide his clothes and cast lots for his clothes. You could take something like even the number of silver, pieces of silver that he would be betrayed with on the night he was betrayed, that Zechariah said that in the 6th century BC, and he said he's going to be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Now, some of these things, we may try to manipulate some of those things if we wanted to do that, but there's so many of the prophecies that we could never manipulate. You can't manipulate where you're going to be born, right? You can't manipulate who your parents are going to be. But again, the messianic prophecies are talking about, hey, he's going to be born from the line of David and from the tribe of Judah. That's where he's going to come from. He's going to be a direct descendant from David himself. And you certainly can't manipulate if you're going to be born of a virgin as well, right? There was somebody that they nicknamed the Condor in World War II. The Condor was a double agent, and he took our nuclear secrets and he gave them to the Russians. And then he was supposed to meet the Russian ambassador in Mexico City, and they wanted to know, who he is. They didn't know who he was, and he didn't know them. So how are you going to get together without unidentifying yourself to other people? Well, they came up with this, that here's what you do. When you get there, you write to the secretary secretary of the Russian embassy, and you sign your name, I. Johnson, at the end. And then you go to the Plaza de Colón in Mexico City, and you stand under the statue of Columbus. And then you have a guidebook in your hand, and you put your middle finger in the guidebook. And then when somebody comes up to you and talks to you, you are to say, isn't this a majestic, use the word majestic statue. And then you're supposed to tell you that you are from Oklahoma. And just those 5 things, the people could say, well, that is definitely the condor, because that would not happen by chance. Now let's just take this with some of the chances of the messianic prophecies, compare that in the Old Testament. The Oxford scholar Alfred Edersheim tells us there are 456 different times that there are statements about the Messiah, signs about the Messiah, identifying prophecies about him. And then he goes on to talk about the mathematical probabilities of each one of those. And listen to this. I mean, just like for instance, the mathematical probability of the Messiah being born in Bethlehem would be 1 in 300,000. You say, how did he come about that? Well, he took the approximate population of the earth in those days and then divided it by the approximate population of the little town of Bethlehem. And there's a 1 in 300,000 chance that the person would be born there. The Messiah would be born there, or a person that would fulfill those prophecies would be born there. Okay, and let's do 8. Just even 8 of those things, if they were fulfilled, this is the statistical odds of that. 1 in 10 times 10 to the 1 times 10 to the 17th power. That is a 1 with 17 zeros behind it. And that's just if they fulfill 8. Now, to get our mind around that number, this is a number that if you took the area 5 times the size of North Carolina, basically the entire southeast, and you covered it with silver dollars, and you marked one of those silver dollars with blue, and you put it out there, you hid it out there somewhere, and then you blindfolded somebody, and they walked out there, and for days or weeks or months, and whenever they felt like, they just went down and picked up any silver dollar, and it just happened to be the blue one. That's 1 times 10 to the 17th power. And that's just if 8 of those were fulfilled. Now, if there were 48, what does that number go to? Go ahead and show that. That is 1 times 10 to the 157th power. Now, if we were to put that out, that'd take up most of the screen there. 157 zeros behind that. Now to get our mind around that number we're not going to be using silver dollars. We're going to be using electrons. And an electron, if you remember back in science in high school or in college, you realize that an electron is much smaller than an atom. In fact, you could count 4 electrons every second for 19 million years, and you would get 1 inch, approximately 1 inch. And now if you took that one of those little electrons, and you were able to somehow mark that, and then you were able to put it in this kind of space, if you were to take something, we realize how enormous, incredibly enormous our solar system is. Imagine something 11,000 or 1,000 times bigger than that. Imagine the incredible size of that. And somehow somebody was to go up in a rocket ship, spaceship, and they were to just let that out in space, somewhere in a size 1,000 times the size of our solar system. And then somebody else was to go up in a spaceship and somehow just look for it with a microscope and find it in 1 year. That's the statistical odds of just 48 of the prophecies being fulfilled. Now remember what he said, how many there were? 456 he identified. I've never seen somebody that identified it with less than 300. So basically the question is this: who is this child? This child, absolutely, the one in the manger that day, is the one who fulfilled all those messianic prophecies. And the statistical odds of anybody else doing that are ridiculous. He was the one who was the coming Messiah, the one who all the prophecies prophesied about. And then Isaiah prophesied this, that the Messiah would be born of a virgin, that he was going to be born in a different way than anybody else that has ever been born before or since. Of the billions and billions of people that have been born on this earth, he's saying there's going to be one that is absolutely unique in the conception. And let's do another little detour and talk about the doctrine of the virgin birth. The virgin birth Jesus' birth was supernatural, but it was not mythical. In other words, it was miraculous, absolutely, but it wasn't made up. This story was not made up. That Matthew and Luke, they were the two gospel writers that talked about the birth of Jesus. Luke basically talked more about Mary's version of it and what was happening in her life, and talked also about the shepherds. Matthew was focusing more on what was happening in Joseph's life, and he also talked about the story of the Magi, the wise men, coming to worship Jesus. But we have no reason to believe these, and both of them talk about Jesus was born of a virgin. And we have no reason to believe that these guys were gullible in any way. You think about their profession. One of them, Matthew, was a tax collector. In other words, he was basically a glorified accountant. And I don't know about you, but I have never met an accountant that was not incredibly precise and accurate. Luke, on the other hand, he was a doctor, and again, that yes, medicine has changed a lot in 25 centuries, but no one ever wondered where a baby came from or how a baby was conceived. That's not a new thing. And something else that is absolutely not a new thing is it's not a recent discovery that virgins don't conceive. In fact, N.T. Wright, in his book, Who is Jesus?, he puts it like this. First century folk knew every bit as much as we do that babies are produced by sexual intercourse. When in Matthew's view of the story, Joseph heard about Mary's pregnancy, his problem arose not because he didn't know the facts of life, but because he did. And you take a look too at Luke apparently consulted Mary in all this whole story of what happened in the whole birth narrative, is because, at least twice that he said this. He said that she pondered all these things and treasured them in her heart. Well, how would he have possibly known that unless he talked to her? And so many of the details of the birth, the only way he would know this if Mary had shared, including how the baby came about. And the concept of the virgin birth is blatantly supernatural. It goes against what would normally happen. It is blatantly in our face about that. And I think it's absolutely genius. And it's because of this, a few reasons. The supernatural virgin birth is the perfect way for Jesus' supernatural life to begin on this earth. I mean, you think about it, his whole life was supernatural, right? He could turn water into wine. He could walk on water. He could calm a storm. He could heal people. He could heal the deaf, the blind. He could make people rise from the dead, for heaven's sake. That is supernatural. And then also the end of his life, we believe that he rose from the dead. That is blatantly supernatural as well. So if his whole life and his death and his resurrection is supernatural, is it any strange thing to think that his conception and his birth should be supernatural as well? Something else is the virgin birth was God's ingenious way of making it possible for Jesus to be fully man and fully God. I mean, Jesus was 100% man, 100% God. We'll talk about that more sometime. But here's the thing that's wild, is in order for him to be 100% man, he had to be born of a human being, right? Of a woman. And he had to be born a human child. But for him to be 100% divine, it couldn't have happened the normal way. And that's my devotion this morning, was the Holy Spirit overshadowed her. So this beautiful thing of a virgin birth is the thing that God combined the divine with the human, and both of those things could go together only if he was born of a virgin. The other thing is the virgin birth tells us something profound, and it's fully displays that humanity's need for salvation couldn't be accomplished by itself. We were so messed up in our sin that our Redeemer had to come from the outside. And the virgin birth has been a target for critics for a long time. But here's the thing that's wild that blew me away, is in a poll that 79% of the people in our country believe in the virgin birth. And 27% of the people that would declare themselves non-Christians, that's the way they would label themselves, believe in the virgin birth. I think that's amazing. But here's something that also is pretty wild for me, is how does somebody believe that God created everything from nothing, and yet that person could struggle with the miracles in the Bible or the miracles that God still does today? Which is more difficult? Which is more difficult for God to, for something to happen where to create all the waters, all the seas, all the oceans, all the ponds, all the lakes, all the rivers, all the streams, everything, and create all those things, or to be able to part a couple of those things so his people could walk through? Which is more difficult to create all the billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, or to have one of those stars do something funky so some magi from the east can come along and go, wow, there's the Messiah, there is where he's going to be born? Which is more incredible, to create all the reproductive systems of all the birds, of all the animals, of all the reptiles, of all the fish, and some of those really, really funky ways, right? And to create all of those, or to bypass the normal way of doing it just the once. I absolutely believe that in the miracles of the Bible, because I believe the first 10 words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everything else is just gravy on the potatoes, right? And also here, it said, the virgin will conceive and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. You know, when with is such an awesome word, isn't it? It's a connecting word. It's a bonding word. It's a bridge word. It's a unifying word. When you say, come with me, that he's with me, she's with me, they're with us. When a little kid says, come play with me. When a woman is with child, can you get more intimate and more together than that? You take a look, also something we know is the best way to show somebody your love for them is to be with them, right? I mean, if you like somebody, if they're your friend, you want to be with them. You want to hang out with them. You want to talk with them. If you love a person, you want to hold hands with them. You want to talk with them. You want to study with them. No, you want to be things with them. And think about when you stand before God and man, when you say your vows, you're saying for better and for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do we part. I'm going to be with you. It's a connecting word. And I came across a story about Father Damien, and it's an amazing story that I think really shares about God being with us. Most people have never heard of the island of Molokai. Well, it's located in the state of Hawaii, and it has quite a history. You have to go way back to the late 1800s to understand its significance. You see, back then there was no cure for the highly contagious and deadly disease called leprosy, which is known as Hansen's disease today. A disease that would attack the extremities of the body, the ears, the toes, the nose, the fingers. A terrible, dreadful disease which today is curable, but back then it wasn't. So in order to keep the disease at bay, in order to keep it from spreading and creating an epidemic, the government would send lepers to a colony on the island of Molokai, where they would be secluded and isolated from those who were not infected with the disease. Well, in 1873, there was a young, brave Catholic priest named Father Damien who volunteered to spend his life serving the people secluded on the island of Molokai. When he arrived, he was startled to see people who were not only suffering physically, but socially, emotionally, and spiritually as well. In the leper colony, he saw extreme drunkenness, immorality, abuse, and an overall sense of hopelessness. What he saw were people who desperately needed to know the answer to the question we all ask, where is God? They needed God's presence in their life. And so in 1873, Father Damien lived among the 700 lepers, knowing the dangers, realizing the inevitable results of so much personal contact with highly contagious disease. He built hospitals, clinics, and churches, and he himself built some 600 coffins. And the whole while he was giving them the answer to that question, where is God? And whenever a church service was held, he would stand up in front of the lepers and he would warmly and lovingly address them as my dear brethren. But then one morning in 1885, at the age of 45, in a calm, clear voice, instead of my dear brethren, he began with, my fellow lepers, I am now one of you. You see, it was out of love that a humble priest became one of them. Out of love, he gave those lepers a gift that would change their life for all eternity. He shared with them the answer to the ever-present question, where is God? And the only way he could give them the answer was by becoming one of them. If you ever ask the question, what is God like? All you have to do is look at Jesus. He is perfect theology. He's exactly what God is like. That how does God relate to us? Through Emmanuel, God with us. How do we relate to God? Through Emmanuel, God with us. And I want you to hear the thing about God being with you. You know what that means? That means on your ride home, God will be with you. Right now, God is with you. When you wake up in the morning and you brush your teeth and do whatever you do, God's gonna be with you. When you go to school, when you go to work, when you stay home, whatever it is, God's gonna be with you. When you do your chores, when you mow the lawn, when you blow the leaves, when you wash the dishes, God is going to be with you. When you are lonely, God is with you. And I really feel I'm supposed to say this, that there's somebody here that you feel lonely, but you need to know you're never, ever alone. God is always going to be with you, and he promises to never, ever forsake you as well. That means he's not going to leave you in the same situation that he found you. When you rejoice, God is with you. When the nights seem long and forever, God is with you. When you play with your child, God is with you. When you sleep tonight, God is going to be with you. There's never going to be a time ever in your life where God is not with you. In good times, in bad times, in all the in-between times, God is with you. This Christmas season, God is going to be with you. In 2023, God is going to be with you for the rest of your life, every day of your life, every moment of your life. Emmanuel, God with you, is with you. And you know what that means? That means this, that who is this child? What child is this? First of all, he is God that comes to earth to save us from our sins. He is the long-awaited Messiah, the fulfillment of all the messianic prophecies. And he also is God with you wherever you go, whatever you do. Amen.